President Trump will head to Capitol Hill Tuesday to meet with House Republicans on immigration as the White House clarifies an earlier remark by the president that he would not sign a compromise bill supported by GOP leaders. Good evening. I'm John Scott. This is the Fox Report. The White House now saying the president would happily sign either of the two Republican bills under consideration in the House. The more moderate proposal would allocate $25 billion for the border wall and offer new protections for the so-called Dreamers. It also would end the separation of children and parents at the border, a policy that President Trump lays squarely on Democrats.
The Democrats, by the way, are very weak on immigration. If you notice, when I came over, they were all saying about separating the families, and that's a Democrat bill. That's Democrats wanting to do that, and they could solve it very easily by getting together, but they think it's a good election point. I think it's a horrible election point for them.
Garrett Tenney is at the White House for us now. Garrett, the White House blames Democrats for the policy that separates children and parents at the border, but it was this administration that enacted the policy.
Yeah, John, this goes back to the zero tolerance policy that the Justice Department introduced last month, stating that anyone caught crossing the border illegally will be prosecuted. So as a result, when parents are arrested, charged, and awaiting trial, their children are transferred to the custody of Health and Human Services and eventually placed with relatives, juvenile detention centers, or into foster care. The Trump administration argues the only reason it's needing to take such drastic actions is because Democrats have refused to close the loopholes in our immigration system, which folks crossing the southern border are seeking to take advantage of. This morning, the president also made immigration an election issue, tweeting, "Democrats can fix their forced family breakup at the border by working with Republicans on new legislation for a change. This is why we need more Republicans elected in November." Now, the president has argued that if more Republicans are in Congress, it'll make passing immigration reform, as well as a whole host of his other campaign issues, make it that much easier to pass those through. John?
There also are renewed trade tensions with China. How is the White House responding, Garrett?
Yeah, John, the world's two largest economies are once again on the brink of a trade war. And on Friday, the White House announced a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of Chinese goods. And China quickly responded with its own $50 billion worth of tariffs. And this comes after several rounds of trade negotiations failed to resolve disputes over China's trade practices and their $375 billion trade surplus. Yesterday, the U.S. Trade representative downplayed concerns that these latest moves will in fact push us closer to a trade war.
We have gone on for a number of years, 14 or 15 years, where there's been a policy that China has had that's been very successful for them. It has allowed them to grow their economy at a very, very fast pace, usually or often at the expense of U.S. technology and other U.S. sectors. So what we want to do, what the president wants to do, is change the paradigm.
Yeah, and the president is receiving support for these latest tariffs from an unlikely ally. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer is supporting the move, calling them right on target. Now, we've also been told that the White House has already prepared additional tariffs against China in response to China's retaliatory moves. We expect those in the next week or two, John.
Garrett Tenney at the White House. Thank you.
You got it.
Let's bring in Sagar Enjeti, White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. So the tit-for-tat trade war, if you will, between China and the Trump administration seems to be growing more serious by the day. What is China specifically aiming at here, Sagar?
Sure, John. So China is very upset about these intellectual property tariffs, and they're trying to hit the president exactly where it hurts. They are targeting the U.S. agricultural sector, and specifically, they're going after the president's base throughout the Midwest. They're going after soybean, they're going after sorghum, and other such crops. And the reason for that is they are explicitly trying to target the states which flipped from Democrat to Republican to elect Donald Trump president of the United States. But the Trump administration has made very clear that, the president and Secretary Perdue of Agriculture have said that they are totally willing, in order to provide some sort of support to those farmers as prices do skyrocket to a record low. But it is certainly going to be hitting the books for many of these farmers throughout the Midwest. And as Garrett said, it only looks like more tariffs are coming down the pipeline.
So some of those American farmers could be looking at price supports from the government as an answer to the soybeans, whatever crops the Chinese might not be buying?
That's right. I have seen the president with Secretary Perdue and many of the Midwestern senators in specific meetings talking about this, saying that if the Chinese are going to come after us, then the U.S. is going to support its domestic economic sector, especially because these tariffs have to do with intellectual property. You know, you heard Ambassador Lighthizer there talking about how the Chinese have essentially coasted off American intellectual property for almost 2 decades, which has built up much of their technology sector, which they in turn sell to us and to the rest of the world. And so the president looks at this as a national security issue, as a way to protect U.S. IP. And if they're going to go after our farmers, he has said he's going to support the farmers. But he's also relying on the robust economy that we have here. The president thinks that we have enough wiggle room in the domestic economy because of how good the jobs numbers are, how good the manufacturing sector is, how good consumer spending is. And so he thinks he has some leeway there in order to punish China and really hit them where it hurts.
California is a big agricultural state. It's also one that tends not to support President Trump. So is California agriculture going to be hurt?
I think all agriculture could be hurt if these tariffs do spiral out of control. But I know that Ambassador Lighthizer and the trade negotiations are underway. We just had that latest U.S. delegation that was sent to China, and which they're trying to reconcile this. And there is a sense and a feeling that while Trump does absolutely mean what he says whenever it comes to these tariffs, that if things were to escalate and get out of control, that it is likely that we would see some sort of blink on behalf of the Chinese. But again, it's a risky move, and you see markets reacting. You see some constriction and some of the sell-offs that are there. And I did see today that there is a lot of speculation on Wall Street, whereas if this does get out of control, it would be pretty significant for the world economy.
Yeah. Soybean farmers, especially in this country, sell about $12 billion worth of their product to China every year. Perhaps no surprise that the soybean prices hit their lowest price of the year just this week. And those new tariffs could take effect just after the 4th of July, on July 6th. Is it, how likely, I guess, is it at this point, Sagar, that the two countries could come to some accommodation here?
Within that time frame, those tariffs are likely going to go into effect. But as we have seen consistently, both the Chinese and the United States are giving themselves as much breathing room and as much extension of the dates as possible. A lot of people are saying within the White House and within the Chinese delegation that these are negotiation tactics. And while the president absolutely means what he says whenever he comes to these tariffs, that he's open to a broader deal. That being said, these Section 232 national security tariffs are likely to stay where they are. Whether they spiral out of control and hit those soybean prices even harder is to be said. But, you know, there is definitely government action and consideration in order to help those soybean farmers and other agricultural sector in the case that they are directly affected.
But the president has spoken of his friendship with President Xi of China, you know, says, well, he's been quite glowing, frankly, about their relationship. Could he pick up the phone to President Xi and work something out that's not going to affect American farmers, but also, you know, might result in more U.S. products and a smaller deficit?
People like to pick on the president's, you know, friendship with President Xi, but he also says consistently that he's a tough negotiator, and that he says he always says he's for China and I'm for the United States. And so in terms of using that friendship, I'm sure that he certainly has. And we've had so many different trade delegations and meetings. In one particular case, the trade delegation from China actually was brought into the Oval Office, and the vice minister of China was brought for direct negotiations with the president. So these do go to the highest levels. I'm sure that there are back channels that were going back and forth. And it's very sad to have Larry Kudlow in the hospital at this time, or recovering at home at this time, because he was also very, very directly involved in these negotiations. And he was said to have a good relationship with the Chinese, given his predilection for free trade. Yeah,
and given the Chinese relationship with North Korea, I mean, they're about the only ones who have a relationship with North Korea. And the president coming off of this very important and, in his words, his view, successful summit, perhaps the Chinese are feeling they have a little extra room to flex their muscle right now?
I think both sides feel that they have extra room for muscle. The president, his unmitigated belief is that the North Korean summit was an absolute success. So he's coming out of that summit, and he knows that the Chinese, his suspicion is that they meddled with the North Korean summit, and that after Kim Jong-un's second visit to Beijing, which was secret, that he changed his rhetoric and threatened nuclear war with the United States, which caused that brief cancellation. But after his successful summit, I think that he came back here to the United States. He saw that now that he has a direct line, a direct phone number for Kim Jong-un, and he has that personal relationship, he can also afford to implement the trade agenda which he promised from day one on his campaign.
Sagar Enjeti, White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, President Trump again lashing out at James Comey following the Inspector General's report on the FBI's handling of the Clinton email investigation. The president calling it a total disaster for the FBI director he fired and other agency officials. Molly Henneberg is in Washington right now. Molly, some Republicans want to know why FBI agent Peter Strzok still has a job at the Bureau.
That's right, John. Republicans say they want to know exactly what FBI agent Peter Strzok meant when he said, quote, "we'll stop it," referring to Trump winning the 2016 election. In newly released text between Strzok and former FBI lawyer Lisa Page, they discussed the possibility of Trump winning. Here's a text from August 2016 that's just been released. Page says, Trump, meaning he, Trump, is not ever going to become president, right? Right? And Strzok says, no, he's not. We'll stop it. That's raising some questions among lawmakers.
He's the key player. He's the central figure throughout this entire narrative. Ran the Clinton investigation, was the lead investigator on the Russia investigation. He's the central character. And I think those sequence of text messages are important. Remember, Peter Strzok opens the Russian investigation on July 31st. 8 days later, we have the text message that we saw in the report. We will stop Trump from being president.
FBI Director Christopher Wray and Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz will go before the Senate Judiciary Committee on Monday to answer questions about this report. And then Horowitz testifies before the House Oversight Committee on Tuesday. John?
Some Republicans liked what they read in that report. What are Democrats taking from it?
Democrats are pointing to the report as evidence that former FBI Director Jim Comey tipped the scales against Hillary Clinton. The IG report criticizes Comey for, quote, ad hoc decision-making in disclosing on October 28, 2016, that some of Hillary Clinton's emails had been found on the laptop of former Democratic Congressman Anthony Weiner, who was married to Clinton aide Huma Abedin. And that still rankles some Democrats who say it helped Donald Trump win.
Look, he is the president of the United States. He was elected by the people of the United States according to the system and according to laws. At the same time, did Jim Comey do something on October 28th that caused public confidence to be eroded in Hillary Clinton's candidacy? No question about it.
The report also calls Comey's actions, quote, extraordinary and insubordinate in discussing publicly the Clinton email investigation in July 2016 and announcing that she would not be prosecuted without clearing that with his supervisors. John?
Molly Henneberg in Washington, thank you. Well, right now, former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort is in a Virginia jail, locked up after a judge revoked his $10 million bond. Why he could be behind bars for quite a while. Plus, tragedy in the heartland. 2 of Kansas City's finest are killed in the line of duty.
Yesterday was a terribly tragic day for 2 of our young, bright, committed sheriff's deputies. TK and Patrick gave their lives for us, and they did so fully aware and willing to do so.
A terrifying scene on a crowded Moscow street right off Red Square. A taxi barreling into pedestrians on a sidewalk, injuring at least 8 people, as the Russian capital is filled with tourists there for the World Cup. Now the driver's in custody and a criminal investigation is underway. Brian Yanis joins us with more. Brian.
Hi, John. Well, Moscow's traffic monitoring agency says the taxi driver is now telling Russian police he fell asleep behind the wheel, causing his car to go onto a busy sidewalk, mowing down pedestrians at the Red Square in Moscow. 8 people are injured. 2 of the injured are Mexican. The streets of Moscow are festive and packed with viewing parties and World Cup fans from everywhere. These are photos from the scene, but horrific video online shows the taxi driver coming to an almost complete stop before it swerves to its right, accelerating onto a sidewalk, hitting pedestrians for 5 long seconds before the car stops. And then the driver just runs out of the cab as about a dozen bystanders chase him. The driver was detained. He's a citizen of the former Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan, and he told police it was not intentional. Russian authorities have opened a criminal investigation and are characterizing it as a traffic accident. Witnesses, though, well, they find that hard to believe.
I have the feeling he did it deliberately because he was in the traffic jam with the cars going really slow. How can you lose control of the wheel, push the gas, and drive into the crowd?
Now, this incident comes just a day after the U.S. State Department issued a travel advisory urging Americans to reconsider traveling to Russia for the World Cup because of the heightened danger for terrorist attacks. The State Department warns Americans who do, well, they may not get exactly the help that they expect. Look at this from the advisory. Quote, due to the Russian government imposed reduction on U.S. diplomatic personnel in Russia, the U.S. government has reduced ability to provide services to U.S. citizens. And John, more than 88,000 Americans have bought World Cup tickets. That's the second most of any nation, only second to the Russians. John.
Well, let's hope those games go on safe. Thanks very much, Brian Youngs.
Of course.
It is one of the biggest gatherings of evangelical Christians in the country. How the Southern Baptist Convention is trying to attract a new generation. Plus, a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Yemen. Civilians trapped amid intense fighting between a Saudi-led coalition and anti-government rebels allied with Iran. Another tragedy for the law enforcement community. A second sheriff's deputy has died in Kansas City after an inmate overpowered 2 officers, transferring him to a courthouse. The other deputy died shortly after the incident. Jeff Paul joins us now. Jeff, this suspect, what do we know about him?
Well, John, we know the suspect was also shot during the incident. He was taken to the hospital, went into surgery, and is now stable. But the sheriff's department isn't going into many details regarding who the suspect is or their possible criminal past until the DA officially files charges. What we can say is the suspect was being escorted from the courthouse back to the jail by both deputies. At some point, investigators say the inmate broke free and managed to shoot the deputies, killing them both.
From what I observed and what I believe the investigation will show is they followed proper procedure. So we always evaluate procedures, but we did confirm that they did follow proper procedure.
Now, they also say this happened in a secure gated area at the courthouse and believe the gun was possibly taken from one of the deputies. To their best knowledge, investigators believe the inmate was cuffed at the time. John?
Wow, unbelievable. Thanks very much, Jeff Paul. A crisis situation in Yemen as Saudi-led forces wage an all-out assault on a rebel-held port town that serves as a gateway for much of the country's food shipments. Ryan Chilcote is in London.
John, Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is getting some help from the United States, are fighting a proxy war in Yemen. On the one side of the battle, you've got those Saudi-led forces working together with the government of Yemen, which has been in exile, and also getting some assistance from the U.S. in terms of targeting and refueling for Saudi aircraft. They're trying to take that airport. On the other side, you've got the Iranian-led forces. They're working together with the Houthi rebels. They've held that airport for a good while, and they want to continue to do so. Why is it so important? Well, strategically, obviously, it's important for the war in Yemen, but it's also where 70% of the food in the country comes through. Think about that. 2 out of 3 people in Yemen, and this is a country of 27 million people, rely on humanitarian assistance and food that comes through that airport. And aid groups are concerned that if there is a lull or a pause in that food getting through because of protracted fighting, that will mean more hunger.
We are very fearful that any kind of blockage of the free flow of humanitarian food, also commercial stocks of particularly food and fuel could have a major impact on people who are already highly vulnerable.
The worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now is in Yemen. 8.5 million people, that's roughly the population of New York City, are on the verge of starvation there. John?
Ryan Chilcote. Ryan, thank you. Tomorrow, Bret Baier takes a look at the end of the Cold War and the role President Reagan played in the collapse of the Soviet Union. 3 days in Moscow highlights the importance of the fourth and final summit between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. That's Sunday night, 8 and 11 p.m. Eastern, right here on Fox News Channel. Well, a young boy gets too close to a pricey work of art. Now his parents could be on the hook for more than $100,000. Plus, the fate of thousands of so-called dreamers hangs in the balance as the House prepares to vote on competing immigration bills. The latest in this contentious debate coming up.
That was 283 days ago that the President of the United States said, "Congress, act." And Congress slumbered.
I'm John Scott, and this is the Fox Report. It's the bottom of the hour. If you're just joining us, President Trump set to meet with House Republicans Tuesday as the debate heats up on Capitol Hill and all over this country on a path forward on immigration. The president calling out Democrats, tweeting they can stop the separation of children from their families at the border if they work with Republicans. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi had this to say yesterday.
This is the first time in this era that we've had a president that has rejected newcomers to our country. So to see this president use this as a political tool, that's what this is about. And he's using these young children.
Jillian Turner is in Washington now with more. Jillian.
The president's sticking to his guns when it comes to his immigration priorities. He plans to continue to enforce a policy that separates immigrant parents from their children at the southern border, in spite of his publicly expressed hate for the policy. In a tweet this morning, he puts the onus on Democrats, writing, "Democrats can fix their forced family breakup at the border by working with Republicans on new legislation for a change." This the day after he stunned Republican leadership with a declaration on Fox and Friends that he would not support a compromise immigration plan months in the making.
I'm looking at both of them. I certainly wouldn't sign the more moderate
What does the bill have to have in it?
I need a bill that gives this country tremendous border security. I have to have that.
Though the White House press staff went on defense and immediately clarified those remarks, insisting the president will sign onto one of the two Republican-led bills, frustration is still rampant on Capitol Hill.
He's using children, whether they're dreamers or whether they're little children at the border now, for a political purpose. It's shameful.
Administration insiders say that by continuing to enforce this separation policy, the president's playing a long game. He hopes to ultimately force the Democrats' hand and increase the chances of reaching a broader compromise on immigration. The hot ticket items for the president include funding for border security, including the wall, and curtailing illegal entries, all of which his GOP colleagues insist they've got covered.
That consensus bill has not, I think, we've been working with the White House on it, but I don't think it's been fully vetted with him yet. And it contains all of the things that he mentioned in that interview that were important to him, all of the pillars.
Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security released figures revealing almost 2,000 children were forced into separation from their parents during a period of only 6 weeks between April and May of this year. John?
Jillian Turner in Washington, thank you. For more on this, we turn again to Sagar Enjeti, White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. So there are a couple of bills on Capitol Hill right now. The so-called compromise bill has these elements: a path to citizenship for the dreamers, the people who are adults now brought to this country as children, $25 billion to build the president's long-desired border wall. It would also bring an end to the diversity visa lottery system and put limits on so-called chain migration or family migration. Does that have a chance of passing, Sagar?
Well, you know, that is a very open question right now. As I understand it, they are still a couple of votes short, but the House is certainly whipping this. And I know that the House Majority Leadership has requested an explicit presidential tweet in favor of this bill in order to give some of the more hardline members of Congress some cover in order, because they would be supporting a pathway to citizenship for the Dreamers. That really has been a yardstick for measurement of whether people are viewed as a hardliner or not on the issue. But the president and his team believe that by offering a pathway to citizenship for those Dreamers, and by doing so, they in exchange are willing to do that for the border security funding, for the end to the diversity visa lottery system, and especially for the curtailments in legal immigration over the several period of years. As I understand it, the White House officials are emphasizing that this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment in order to actually change the U.S. both legal and illegal immigration system, which would significantly reduce the number of low-skilled immigrants to this country over the next 10 to 15 years.
What are the chances that this compromise measure might actually get some Democrat votes?
Almost certainly not. And the reason for that is because it does include curtailments of long-term legal migration. And that's something that many Democratic lawmakers have said is an absolute no-go for them. They view that as an encroachment on existing immigration law, which they're very comfortable with. And in many cases, they would like to expand the immigration pool and grant a pathway to citizenship for the nearly 11 to 20 million illegal immigrants that are in this country. So if it does have a chance of passage, it would be because the president, through an explicit whipping effort, is able to bring together the hardline immigration people within his caucus, as well as people who support a pathway to citizenship for those Dreamers, and then send that bill on the way to the Senate.
Let's talk a little bit about this separation controversy that's going on right now. According to figures from the Associated Press, nearly 2,000 children were separated from their families at the Mexico border in the last couple of months. The Deputy Commissioner for Customs and Border Protection says there's a reason for that. Here's what he had to say.
So if someone crosses the border illegally, then they should be referred for prosecution. We're attempting to do that. Now, a third of the population that we're arresting comes as part of a family or a child alone. The child obviously cannot be prosecuted, but when the family member brings them through this arduous journey, putting them in danger, crossing the border illegally, we refer that parent for prosecution. The children are then taken to these HHS shelters, and they're both given instructions to how to contact each other once the court adjudication takes place. Most of these kids that will go to the shelter will be placed with a family member in the United States as quickly as HHS can do that.
The president's political opponents are howling about these separations, Sagar, as you well know, but what is Customs and Border Patrol supposed to do?
That's exactly the question that the White House is asking. And they would point to this and say, if we do not criminally prosecute illegal immigrants who cross our border, the alternative is that we release them into the interior of the country, through which they would wait for a period of probably several years to appear before a judge to adjudicate their asylum claim. And the reason that we see such a massive spike in the number of asylum claims from people from non-contiguous countries like those from Central America, which comprise much of the people illegally arriving at the border, is because they know that that is a way in order to circumvent U.S. law and avoid deportation. Because we have such generous immigration law and asylum laws, we have to accept these people and hear them out in a court of law. So what the Trump administration is doing is they're cracking down on the criteria for the type of people that they're going to give asylum to, and they're criminally prosecuting every adult who crosses the U.S.-Mexico border as a deterrent policy. Now, the president has blamed Democrats, and specifically a Democratic law, for doing this, but it's actually because of a Supreme Court settlement from a court settlement from the late 1990s called the Flores settlement, and that is actually what requires a certain set of laws to house children in separate, less stringent facilities and take them away from their parents in the event that they're criminally prosecuted.
We were talking about the Democrat opposition to this so-called compromise bill. Politics is horse trading. Are Democrats not willing to trade citizenship or a path to citizenship for Dreamers in exchange for these reduced immigration numbers?
They have held the line on this consistently, and I believe that they have an ally in much of the mainstream press, because many of them will parrot, many of these stories that are going down at the border. And it is absolutely tragic to have 2,000 children separated from their parents. But consistently we have seen as of yet, no real effort by Democratic lawmakers to meet the president even halfway in terms of border security, and especially in terms of long-term cuts to legal immigration. And so until that holds, this is unlikely to go anywhere. And the president and the White House and the Trump administration are looking at this and saying that we have record number of people who are illegally crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. In order to stop perverse incentives of essentially letting people go free once they arrive here, they're tracking down and they're getting tough by criminally prosecuting them.
Yeah, we could see a vote in Congress as early as the upcoming week. Sandra Engetti from the Daily Caller, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
There's new reaction after former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort is sent to jail. A federal judge revoking Manafort's bail yesterday. He will stay behind bars through his trial, which begins in September. The judge saying she cannot turn a blind eye to allegations of witness tampering against Manafort. Attorney Alan Dershowitz on Fox and Friends calling that decision unfair.
There are thousands of people today in jail before they've been convicted of any crime, many of them minorities, many of them poor. Now Paul Manafort joins them based on an indictment. And indictments are not supposed to have any real impact. We still have a presumption of innocence.
Special counsel Robert Mueller filed the latest charges against Manafort 2 weeks ago. At least 17 people are dead after a massive brawl led to a stampede at a nightclub in Caracas, Venezuela. The situation spiraled out of control after someone detonated a tear gas canister. Officials say 8 minors are among the dead. 7 people are arrested in connection with the incident. Well, change is in the air in Dallas this week at one of the largest gatherings of evangelical Christians in the nation. The Southern Baptists holding their annual convention and electing the youngest president ever. Lauren Green has the story.
It's the first meeting of the Southern Baptists since the Me Too movement and recent scandals where top Baptist leaders have been forced to step down because of inappropriate sexual behavior. But the largest Protestant Christian denomination in the U.S. has an eye on the future.
J.D. Greear is the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Meet 45-year-old pastor J.D. Greear, the youngest leader in almost 4 decades.
It's exciting and humbling. I think there's something happening in the SBC.
Greear beat out a longtime old guard Baptist preacher Ken Hemphill in a 69 to 31% vote. But Greear insists it's not about getting rid of the old, instead seeing himself as a bridge builder and one who understands the needed emphasis on diversity and engaging a younger demographic.
We don't want, especially the younger generation, feeling like this is their father's or grandfather's convention. And we want to engage and we want to show up and we want to be responsible for the institutions that help lead the way out in mission.
The new era also sees a larger role for women, but not in the pulpit, as it still holds to traditional gender roles. And that doesn't sit well with critics who blame that good old boy attitude for the scandals that forced the recent departure of 3 prominent SBC leaders.
When it comes to abuse, both physical, sexual, emotional, all of that, it's really important that the church takes a stand.
Adding to strife at the convention was the last-minute addition of Vice President Mike Pence, the self-titled evangelical Catholic who invited himself to speak.
What is said in Washington echoes around the world, and having him, Mr. Pence, come further hinders our work.
Pence stressed a message of prayer, but also politics, listing the administration's accomplishments and asking for their continued support.
As I stand before you today, I say with confidence, jobs are back. Confidence is back, and under President Donald Trump, America is back, and we're just getting started.
Although the Southern Baptists have seen an increase in the number of churches, now over 47,000, there's been a continuing decline in the number of baptisms and members. The hope is the new president will help turn those numbers around. In New York, Lauren Green, Fox News.
Well, wrangling 5-year-olds can be tough duty, but as this video will prove, failing to do so can cost you. One couple could be on the hook for big money after their son knocks over a pricey work of art. Plus, flight delays aggravate travelers and cost billions every year, but the Federal Aviation Administration has a plan to make things better. And Water's World coming up at the top of the hour. Here's a preview.
Dennis Rodman is crying, people are catching on fire, and monkeys are smoking weed. Wild Waters World tonight.
I'll try to put this on your American Express. Parents of a 5-year-old Kansas boy hit with a $132,000 bill after their son knocked over a sculpture on display at a community center. There it goes. Boom. The city's insurance company claims the sculpture, called Aphrodite de Kansas City, is damaged beyond repair and that the parents were negligent for not supervising their boy. The boy's mother says it was an accident and the art should have been protected. The parents have sent the bill to their own insurance company to try to resolve the dispute. Well, flight delays cost billions of dollars every year, not to mention the aggravation. But now there's a new push to bring air traffic control into the 21st century. Douglas Kennedy has more.
So you got bad weather here in Charlotte, which to you means flight delays.
Yeah, flight delays they're coming from our archaic system.
As head of flight operations for American Airlines in North Carolina, Bernie Davis's job is to get passengers in and out as quickly as possible. So unfortunately, the FAA has been really slow to modernize, relying on radios to communicate with pilots.
Yes, just the design of the microphone that you have there is only for one aircraft. If you get more people talking, it's clutter, it slows down the operations.
Alaska 9903. And slow operations can cost the U.S. up to $25 billion a year. For years, American Airlines has been pushing fellow carriers to adopt a modern air traffic control system. It's called NextGen, or Next Generation, and it includes switching from radios to smart texting technology found in cell phones. Lauren Cass oversees American operations across the country. So here in Charlotte, you are working with NASA in a pilot program to get your planes in the air quicker.
Absolutely. We've developed an algorithm with NASA and the FAA that allows us to push back aircraft at a specific time to eliminate taxi delays.
Cass also recently spearheaded the shift from ground-based radar tracking that relies on paper strips in control towers in favor of satellite-based GPS tracking. And in June, he seemed to get a rousing endorsement from President Trump.
A modern air traffic control system will make life better for all Americans who travel, ship, or fly.
Still, NextGen does have its critics. Smaller airlines and private plane owners say the technology will be too expensive. NextGen also encompasses privatizing some air traffic control, now run by the FAA, a proposal that has some skeptics in powerful places. Congress is now the main obstacle for the FAA to give up control.
Absolutely. The FAA needs a stabilized funding stream, which they don't have today, as they start and stop programs with continuing resolutions.
He says the funding stream in Congress is simply too erratic for major changes like NextGen. Inside the air traffic control tower in Charlotte, Douglas Kennedy, Fox News.
It's a wild day at the U.S. Open, as some of the biggest names in golf are knocked out of that tournament, and Dustin Johnson looks to build on what was a commanding lead. Highlights straight ahead. Plus, after 2 months in the hospital and missing the prom, a 15-year-old girl gets her big night. We'll tell you who made it happen and how they pulled it off.
Tonight.